Well, my name is Paul Washer, and I am 47 years old. I was born in 1961 to a father who was an unbeliever, but a mother who was a strong believer. Her mother, Croatian, was actually persecuted for the faith. My grandfather on my father's side was one of the first missionaries to Brazil, and served there in the 20s and 30s when it was much of jungle and nothing else. So I was raised in something of a Christian heritage. When I was 9 years old, I made a profession of faith, and I even wept, but there was no real change in my life whatsoever. And as I grew older, I began to live in greater and greater ungodliness. Of course, being in the denomination I was in, because I had prayed a prayer and asked Jesus into my heart, I always believed that I was saved. Then when I went to college, I found myself, after a few years, just at the end of my ropes. Academically, I was doing fine, but morally, I knew that I was a wretch. I knew that I was self-centered, full of pride, a liar, would do anything to benefit self. And more it was weighed upon me, just my wretchedness. And one night at about 1 in the morning, when I was contemplating how wretched I was, someone knocked on the door, and it was a freshman from across the hall. And he was trembling. And I asked him why he was trembling. And he said, "Well, you're probably going to punch me." And I said, "Well, you're probably right. It's 1 in the morning." And he said, "For 2 weeks, God's been telling me to tell you something, but I'm afraid of you. But I can't stand it any longer, so I have to tell you." And he said, "I have a message from God." And I literally thought, what, is he some kind of wacko or something? And he said, "This is the message. God says that you are wretched and you are miserable, and you will continue to be miserable until you surrender your life to Jesus Christ." And it was at that moment that God truly began to work in my life in a tremendous way. I was a very, very immoral person. I always say there was nothing noble about my rebellion. If you look up jerk in the dictionary, it had my picture there. That's all I was. Just a self-centered, harmful person. And Christ began to work in my life, and eventually I was converted. And from there immediately, I felt a burden to preach, whether it was on the streets or soul winning on the street corner or speaking to my friends. And began to just preach the gospel, what I thought was the gospel. I ended up going to seminary, and after seminary, I was greatly influenced by George Mueller and Hudson Taylor. And so I wanted to go to the mission field, but not with an organization and without really raising support or telling people about what God was doing. And my little Baptist church, where I was a member in Illinois, under their authority, it was a small church in the middle of a cornfield, I went to Peru. And God began to do miraculous things there. It was a very dangerous country at the time with the terrorist movement, the Sendero Luminoso, or Shining Path. War was on, bombs exploding, dead people in the streets. But God used all of that to begin to transform my life. But mainly I was challenged by an ex-Catholic priest who had become an evangelical Baptist pastor, to read the Bible just over and over and over. He asked me to teach a class in his seminary, and the first semester was the students had to read their Bible, the entire Bible that semester, and write their comments on every chapter. And so I began studying the Bible about 10 hours a day, and that is where my life began to change. I began to see that the gospel that I was preaching was not truly a biblical gospel. I had taken as Paul says to Timothy, the glorious gospel of our blessed God, and I had reduced it down to 4 little questions or 5 principles or 4 spiritual laws, and if someone said yes to every one of my questions and prayed a prayer at the end, I pronounced them saved. And I realized there was always a catch in my spirit when I would do that. And I realized that many of the people who were converted on the street with me never showed up to church, never grew in godliness. So I began to study the Scriptures more and more. After reaching some conclusions, I came back to the States for a few months of rest. And there, someone presented to me Charles Spurgeon, George Whitefield, many of the men who are most used to spread the gospel. And I saw that the gospel they preached was quite different than our contemporary gospel. And it confirmed the things the Lord began to teach me. At that point, I had an insatiable desire to understand the cross of Calvary. And until today, 20 years later, the topic of most of my study is what happened that day on that tree. And as I travel around the world and I teach on the cross of Jesus Christ, not something new, not some new revelation, but just the old, classic, historical teaching of the substitutionary atonement of Jesus Christ bearing our sin and dying under the wrath of God to satisfy His justice so that God might be just and the justifier of the wicked, I find that even sincere Christians who've been walking with Christ for 20 and 30 years come up to me with tears in their eyes and say, I've never understood how the death of Christ truly paid for my sins, but now I do. I've always trusted in it for years, but I've never understood it. And so I began to see that this country and this world is not so much gospel hardened as it is gospel ignorant. And it's gospel ignorant because we ourselves have reduced the gospel down to something that will fit in a track in the back of someone's pocket. And so that's more of the testimony of my life. When I was in Peru, we began supporting indigenous missionaries. And that has grown tremendously now to where we are supporting missionaries through an organization called Heart Cry, missionaries around the world in about 15 different countries on 4 continents. God has greatly blessed that ministry. And that's where I spend most of my time now. If I'm not preaching in the States, I'm overseas instructing and teaching missionaries.